Before 1450, a single book was worth more than a house. Only the church and the nobility could touch knowledge. Then one German goldsmith built a machine that broke their monopoly on truth, and the world would never be the same. Imagine a world where you cannot read. Not because you are uneducated, but because there is almost nothing to read. In the year 1440, fewer than 30,000 books existed in all of Europe. Combined. Every single one had been copied by hand. A skilled monk, working 10 hours a day, could finish one Bible in about 3 years. 3 years. For one book. The parchment alone required the skins of 200 animals. The ink was hand-mixed. The gold leaf was beaten into the margins one letter at a time. The result was beautiful. The result was also obscenely expensive. A single illuminated Bible in 1440 cost the equivalent of a small farm. Who owned books? The church. A handful of kings. A few of the richest universities. Everyone else lived in a world where the answer to every important question lived inside the head of a priest. And the priest answered in Latin. A language 99% of Europe could not understand. This was not an accident. Knowledge was power, and power was guarded. To control what books existed, to control who could read them, was to control what was true. For 1,000 years, that arrangement held. Then, in a workshop in Mainz, a quiet man started melting lead. His name was Johannes Gutenberg. He was not a scholar. He was not a priest. He was a goldsmith, a man who understood metal, molds, and pressure. And by the late 1440s, he was deep in debt, working in secret, refusing to tell his investors what he was building. The Chinese had printed with carved wooden blocks for centuries. The Koreans had experimented with movable type 100 years earlier. But what Gutenberg created was something different, a complete system. He invented an alloy, lead, tin, and antimony, that melted at low temperatures and cooled into letters of perfect, identical shape. He invented a hand mold that could cast a single letter hundreds of times without variation. He invented an oil-based ink that clung to metal without smearing. And he adapted the wine press, a device any European had seen at harvest time, into a machine that could squeeze fresh ink onto a page with uniform pressure. Each piece was, on its own, a known idea. Together, they were a revolution. Around 1454, Gutenberg pulled the first finished page from his press. The letters were sharp. The lines were straight. The ink was even. For the first time in human history, a book could be copied without a copyist. His first masterpiece was the Bible. It is called the 42-line Bible because each column on each page contains exactly 42 lines. About 180 copies were printed between 1454 and 1455, roughly 40 on vellum, the rest on paper imported from Italy. Look at one of these pages today, and you will not believe it was printed. The letters are so crisp, the alignment so perfect, that for centuries scholars argued whether Gutenberg's Bibles were actually handwritten. But here is the part that changed history. A monk needed 3 years to produce one Bible. Gutenberg's workshop produced 180 in roughly 2 years, and every single copy was identical. Word for word. Letter for letter. The price was still high. A printed Bible in 1455 cost about 30 florins, 3 years of a craftsman's wages. But 3 years of wages was not a small farm. It was a possibility. Gutenberg himself never got rich. He had borrowed heavily from a financier named Johann Fust, and in 1455, Fust sued him, seized the workshop, and took the press. Gutenberg died nearly forgotten in 1468. But by then, the machine had escaped him. And it was multiplying. By 1470, just 15 years after Gutenberg lost his press, printing shops existed in 14 European cities. By 1480, there were 110. By 1500, more than 250 cities had printing presses. And in those 50 years between Gutenberg's first Bible and the dawn of the 16th century, somewhere between 8 and 20 million books were printed across Europe. More books were produced in those 5 decades than monks had copied in the previous 1,000 years. The price collapsed. By 1500, a printed book cost roughly 1/8 what a manuscript had cost in 1450. By 1550, it was 1/40th. A schoolteacher could own a personal library. A merchant could afford books for his children. A blacksmith could buy a pamphlet at a fair. Venice became the printing capital of Europe. At one point, half of all books printed in the world came off Venetian presses. New genres exploded: travel books, cookbooks, medical guides, technical manuals, even crude joke collections. The Church watched this happen with growing unease. For 1,000 years, the priesthood had been the gatekeeper of the written word. Now the word was loose. Anyone with a press could print anything. And one of the men watching most carefully, a German monk named Martin Luther, was about to discover exactly what that meant. On October 31, 1517, an obscure professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg wrote a letter. In it, he listed 95 complaints against the Catholic Church, particularly its sale of indulgences, the practice of charging the faithful for the forgiveness of sins. The complaints were technical. They were written in Latin. They were aimed at fellow theologians. A century earlier, that letter would have ended on a bishop's desk. A reprimand might have followed. Maybe a quiet trial. The matter would have ended there. But it was not a century earlier. It was 1517. And within 2 weeks of Luther's 95 theses being written, printers in Germany were translating them into German and running off thousands of copies. Within 2 months, the theses had been printed across Germany. Within 6 months, they had reached England, France, Italy, and Spain. By 1520, somewhere around 300,000 copies of Luther's various pamphlets were circulating across Europe. The Pope, in Rome, summoned Luther to recant. Luther refused. The Pope excommunicated him. And it didn't matter. Because the Pope could excommunicate a man, he could not excommunicate a printing press. For the first time in European history, ordinary people could read religious arguments in their own language, in their own kitchens, by their own candlelight. They could decide for themselves what they believed. And many of them decided to break with Rome. The Protestant Reformation was not started by Martin Luther. It was started by Martin Luther and printing. Take away the press, and the Reformation is a footnote. Add the press, and Christianity splits in half. The Church was not the only institution the press destabilized. So was every previous assumption about how human beings learn. Before printing, scientific knowledge was fragile. A scholar in Bologna might make a careful observation. A scholar in Oxford might disagree. But the only way to share findings was through expensive, slow, error-prone manuscripts that often arrived corrupted, abridged, or simply lost. Printing changed the nature of evidence itself. For the first time, a diagram in Padua could be reproduced identically in Paris. An astronomer's data table could be circulated without a single number changing. A botanist's drawing of a plant could be sent across the continent, and the recipient knew, with certainty, that he was looking at the same image. In 1543, the astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus published his theory that the Earth orbits the Sun. The book sold modestly, but it was printed, and printed books do not disappear. Galileo built on Copernicus. Kepler built on both. Newton, eventually, built on all of them, and in 1687, his Principia Mathematica became one of the most consequential printed books in human history. This is what we now call cumulative knowledge. The idea that science is a structure each generation builds higher on top of the last. That idea is impossible in a manuscript culture. It only becomes possible when knowledge can be perfectly copied, widely distributed, and reliably preserved. The scientific revolution did not happen because Europeans suddenly got smarter. It happened because, for the first time, they could remember what they had already learned. Trace any thread of the modern world back far enough, and you will find a printing press waiting at the end of it. Democracy required citizens who could read laws and pamphlets. The press created them. Public education required textbooks affordable enough for ordinary children. The press created them. Journalism required the daily, cheap mass distribution of information. The press created it. The novel, the encyclopedia, the constitution, the scientific paper, every one of them is downstream of minds. When the internet arrived in our lifetimes, the comparisons were instant, and they were correct. We had been here before. In 1450, a single book was worth more than a house. Today, every word ever printed sits in your pocket, in a device the size of your hand. The line between those two facts runs straight through a small workshop in Mainz, where a goldsmith in debt refused to give up. Gutenberg never knew what he had done. He died believing he had failed. But every textbook your children will read, every newspaper that holds a government accountable, every scientific paper that will save a life next year, they all started with him. If this changed how you see the modern world, subscribe. We reconstruct a lost world every week.